When my family and I moved to the United States a few months ago, we tried to be as considerate as time allowed when buying an essential household item, mattresses. But there's only so much you can consider in the market before the salespeople start asking you a list of weird questions, doing some calculations on a clipboard, and finally suggesting the $4,000 mattresses because they are tailored to your exact needs for a perfect night's rest. So we walked across the street and went ahead and bought 5 of the next ones we saw, which were some reasonably priced and comfortable mattresses. And that was that. So we got the mattresses back home, and now we needed bed sheets. So we walked into another store, and as we made our way towards the back, where the clearance aisle happens to be, what did we see? Mattresses. And they were identical to the ones sitting on the floor of our new house at that very moment. These mattresses were slightly cheaper than the ones we bought. Nothing crazy, but comparatively, 5 mattresses would have made for a generous save. I know that the mattresses were essentially identical. I even tested them and found no difference. So I was definitely surprised when my dad went and lay down on one of the mattresses and announced to us, no, ours are definitely more comfortable. Let's analyze this. Since I know that the 2 mattresses were the same, did my dad say that just to make our purchase feel worthy or justified? He may not have meant to, but what he had just done defined a sort of cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is a restriction in factual thinking that is caused by the tendency for the human brain to interpret information through a filter of personal experiences and irrational preferences. Cognitive bias represents the meaningless spaces in a rational thought process. You can convince yourself and others that something makes sense, but it is only backed up by experiences of which you could not have foreseen the outcome, or a statistical misunderstanding. In some instances, this can work out, and the outcome will have been predicted, but afterwards, it's important to take a step back and assess what could have happened. What you will often find is that the probabilities of the actual outcome happening and any other outcome happening are nearly equal. Even the fairest and most rational decision makers are victims of cognitive bias. It is human nature. It has evolutionary history and was actually known to allow earlier humans to make decisions without acquiring additional information. It's interesting to learn about cognitive bias because it reveals the power as well as the limitations of the human mind. In this speech, we'll be discussing the history of cognitive bias, some major types of cognitive bias, and how to lead a life without the influence of these dangerous cognitive biases. Okay, anything that challenges the ordinary that the brain grows accustomed to is challenging the brain's authority. As a mechanism of self-defense, the brain will forego logic and rely on other means to justify the end result. Bias exists in our subconscious, and if you think about it, it really does contradict a lot of our conscious decisions and beliefs. Looking at it from an evolutionary standpoint, cognitive biases can be considered as an adaptation for survival. They can be considered shortcuts to save time from complex assessments. Professor of psychology and avid heuristic researcher Hal R. Arks also says, "The extra effort required to use a more sophisticated strategy is a cost that often outweighs the potential benefit of enhanced accuracy." This concept that the human mind adapts develops those shortcuts we've mentioned earlier, and it is observed more and more naturally in the following generations. These shortcuts, the basis of cognitive bias, are often more efficient despite not being as accurate, and have best served the interests of human survival over evolutionary time. So, like we touched on earlier, an example of baseless information that could shape cognitive bias is life experience. According to Dr. Amos, a professor among the world's experts on pregnancy and fertility, having 3 girls does not mean you are any more likely to finally have a son than have a 4th daughter. Overgeneralization, also known as limiting generalization, is a form of cognitive bias where you may have a perspective on a certain topic or idea, simply based on a previous experience, especially one where the outcome was entirely independent of your choices or actions. This can be like associating a stereotype with a racial group simply based on a pleasant or unpleasant interaction with a single member of that racial group. Another closely related cognitive bias is the gambler's fallacy. The human mind is capable of acknowledging patterns in its everyday life, but that is not sufficient enough to validate what the brain perceives. The gambler's fallacy suggests that an event is more likely to occur simply based on the precedent events. If I flipped a coin once, what is the probability that it will land on heads? My dad likes to say that there is a 49.5% chance it'll land on heads, a 49.5% chance it'll land on tails, and a 1% chance it'll land standing up in the middle. But in all seriousness, you would expect a 50% chance of heads or tails. Now, what if I presented you with a sequence? I flipped a coin 6 times and received the following results: heads, tails, 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 and tails. What do you think the 7th coin flip would result in? If you think the chance of the coin landing on either heads or tails is any greater now, you have just fallen victim to the gambler's fallacy. Overall, overgeneralization is a broad term that is often closely associated with the gambler's fallacy, as both suggest an outcome based on previous experience with no scientific proof. This next bias is one I particularly enjoy unpacking. Anchoring bias is a reliance on the first piece of acquired information to make a decision. It's deciding to buy a $40 shirt simply because it is on sale for $25 cheaper. Even if you genuinely liked the shirt, would you have bought it if its sale price was its original price? A study conducted by Tversky and Kahneman asked a group of students to estimate the product of the following math expression: 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 and times 1. I'll give you a second to think about it. Just an approximation, not necessarily an accurate answer. Okay, the second group of students was asked to estimate the product of 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6 times 7 and times 8. The students in the first group, and most likely you too, got a higher answer on average than the students in the second group, despite both sequences being the exact same. The first few numbers set the range for the estimation for the final product. In the first sequence, 8 times 7 already being 56 makes the rest seem as though it would be exponentially larger. And spoiler alert, it is. It's 40,320. Starting off the second sequence with much smaller numbers makes the product seem as though it would be much, much smaller. Okay, the final bias I'll be unpacking circles back to why my dad felt the need to justify our purchase of the mattresses. Confirmation bias is one of the most prominent types of cognitive biases because it encompasses quite a few other more specific biases. Francis Bacon, a leading figure in scientific methodology and natural philosophy, defines cognitive confirmation bias as the peculiar and perpetual error in human understanding to be more moved and excited by affirmatives than by negatives. The question I find to best explain confirmation bias is, why would anyone want to prove that they made a bad choice? Like the name suggests, people adopting this cognitive bias, known as confirmation bias, would look solely for information that confirms their preconceived notions. Similarly, an example would be a first responder attempting to explain all evidence of a crime by linking it to a more aggressive suspect. Instead of using that data to work through an investigation, that first responder would become occupied with proving that suspect guilty. Similarly, people are led by confirmation bias throughout their everyday lives. It explains why my dad made the observation that he did. If we acknowledged that the two mattresses were identical, it would have been upsetting to move on, knowing that just a little more searching would have gotten us that good deal. With that, I'd like you to imagine a conversation between a priest and an atheist. The atheist recounts a recent incident in his life to the priest. He says that he was lost in a forest at night and could not find his way out. In a moment of desperation, he prayed to God to help him. After a while, some campers emerged and led the atheist back to the campsite. The priest will tell him that this was a miracle from God and that he had answered his prayers. But the atheist will claim that it was just incredibly lucky that the campers had found him and that God had played no part in his rescue. This is how their previous beliefs influenced their perspective on the outcome. Okay, so how can we overcome these cognitive biases? A lot of psychology experts will claim that it is impossible to completely overcome cognitive biases. But by working through it step by step, I maintain that it is possible to work towards becoming the most rational version of yourself. The approach that I've developed to combating the dangers of cognitive bias is called the 4 A's, where each A corresponds to a step in a 4-step process to defeating the cognitive biases. The first A refers to acknowledgement, understanding that you as a human being are undeniably going to be a victim of cognitive bias. This also means having a basic understanding of the effects of cognitive bias, which I've already mentioned previously with each major individual type of bias. The second A refers to asking. Ask another person for their opinion. No two minds are alike in this world, and asking someone else for their opinion is more than likely to yield a different opinion or a new perspective. The third A refers to acceptance. Research by Michael Ross and Fior Sikali, leading psychologists in the 1980s, has shown that ego has the largest impact on how much cognitive bias will affect your judgment. Becoming more aware of your own flaws is crucial to developing your rationale. Become open-minded to the idea or possibility of being wrong. The final A refers to activity. Oftentimes, laziness and lack of active interest in pursuing opposing information results in a narrow-minded perspective on a certain topic. Let's say I am a passionate meat eater. I eat it in every meal and even enjoy it as a snack. If someone came up to me and told me that consuming this much meat was bad for me, I would rush to do some research to prove them wrong. If you were in my place, what would you type into Google? Probably something along the lines of health benefits of consuming meat. If that were my response, I would have been fueled by my subconscious bias. Why wouldn't I, or you, think to search the health risks of consuming meat daily? All in all, it's important to be able to consider an opposing argument, even if you don't necessarily end up agreeing with it. In conclusion, what people don't realize is just how much our brains are capable of, but what they also don't consider is just how much accuracy and must be given up for that speedy and efficient decision-making. It's something of a survival instinct that has become a part of our everyday lives. Besides defeating cognitive bias, becoming more considerate and aware of other people and their expressed opinions develops a strong community around you and encourages positive habits. Now, in case you are wondering, we did end up keeping our mattresses, and if the constant fear of being an irrational and judgmental thinker or decision maker after all this time hasn't kept me up at night, I think I would really enjoy the comfort of my mattress. Thank you.